Welcome to this week's lesson of Isaiah and the Book of Mormon. And just so you know, I am struggling to get over a cold right now. It doesn't seem to want to go away. So you might hear some sniffling and snorting as we go through this, which might be why this lesson has the tone that it has. That I don't know if that's why or not. But we're going to get into, I would say, some controversial events of our time, but I'm not making any sort of political commentary. I consider myself to be very apolitical. I'm just trying to share my understanding of this prophecy, which is a prophecy of our time, of course, and future events, as well as to just convey some of what I feel the Spirit is leading me to discuss. And of course, I'm never perfect in doing it, but I'm hopeful that in just sort of covering all these bases, that you will personally receive something during this lesson, some kind of insight, inspiration, or revelation as you ponder and pray about these things that will be helpful for you and your loved ones. So again, forgive the sniffling and let's go into Isaiah now. We're not going to do a verse by verse like we've done in weeks past, so much as just an overview and then honing in on some specific verses. So, first of all, with Isaiah 9:1, it starts off, but it shall not be gloomy to those who have been in anguish for her. So, remember at the end of chapter 8, it was like this gloomy, depressing scene, and people are rowing about hungry and things like that. And this is the yin and yang to that part of the prophecy, right? So it's not going to be gloomy to those who have been in anguish for her. In the past, he humbled the lands of Zebulun and Naphtali, but at the last, he will exalt the sea route by Jordan in Galilee of the nations. Well, what could that possibly mean? Well, the sea route, the Jordan River, I have a map here for you. You can kind of see it runs north to south through this kingdom here of between what eventually became Israel and Judah. And when the Assyrian army came in and took over Israel, routed Israel, they enslaved their people, and the path that they took was to the north along this Jordan River path. And actually, that one lake, I believe, is the Sea of Galilee. It's just not marked as such on this particular map. Now, the name Jordan means to go down or to descend. So, what is the Lord saying here? Well, I believe that what he's saying here is that there's going to be a reversal of circumstances. And just as there was a humbling that took place, a descent that Israel went through when this invasion and in slavery took place, so will by that descent Israel be exalted. Remember, we spoke last week about how there needs to be a descent phase in order to ascend spiritually, to go through that purification, sanctification process. And that's what's going to be happening here. Of course, we're applying this to our day, right? And so going on now, it says in verse 2 that the people walking in darkness have seen a bright light. On the inhabitants of the land of the shadow of death has the light dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased its joy. They rejoice at your presence as men rejoice at harvest time, or as men are joyous when they divide the spoil. There are probably two ways of looking at this, but for the purpose of this prophecy, because of course everything relates to Jehovah, everything is going to relate to him. He is ultimately the light. But if you think of the light in this section, in the sense of the star, and we know from the book of Abraham and other scriptures, stars and planets, especially Abraham 3, it really connects the language of these planets and stars to people, especially noble and great ones. And there was something that led these wise men who were from the east to the presence of their Savior, Jesus Christ. So they followed this light to Jesus Christ in a nutshell. And that's what I believe this is talking about here. And this bright light is this end time servant, this Moses figure who leads people ultimately to Christ. And this enlarging of the nation, this, I believe, has to do with Zion and all the people that we were told last time that there were more than, she realized this woman thought she was bereaved and that she was without children. All of a sudden, there are so many more who are brought in than we realized. So this is a time of harvest, of reaping. And literally, on a literal sense, there could be a land, a kingdom that is established. And just to tie this in with more modern prophecy, in Doctrine and Covenants 45, it says, starting in verse 28, and when the times of the Gentiles is come in, a light shall break forth among them that sit in darkness, and it shall be the fullness of my gospel. Remember, we went into that idea of the fullness, though, extensively 2 lessons ago. But they receive it not, for they perceive not the light, and they turn their hearts from me because of the precepts of men. And in that generation shall the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And there shall be men standing in that generation that shall not pass until they shall see an overflowing scourge, for a desolating sickness shall cover the land. Now, this prophecy, again, sometimes we think, oh, the fullness of the gospel. It's talking about the Book of Mormon because it says it contains the fullness. But this is speaking of a future time where it's that fullness of the times of the Gentiles, and then they actually reject light and truth that comes to them because they are confounded or confused because of the precepts of men, because they're not doing their own work in their study, receiving personal revelation, and so they don't really understand prophecy and what is coming their way. And so this is the time where then it says that certain things are going to happen, like we know have been prophesied. Hopefully most of you are familiar with this idea of a desolating sickness and a scourge that will cover the land. And now if we go to 2 Nephi 3:24, Lehi is prophesying to his seed and speaking about a covenant that will be fulfilled in the end times of this restoration of specifically Lehi's seed. And it says, there shall rise up one mighty among them who shall do much good, both in word and in deed, being an instrument in the hands of God with exceeding faith to work mighty wonders and do that thing which is great in the sight of God, under the bringing to pass much restoration unto the house of Israel and unto the seed of thy brethren. So this would be a type of things. I know that before it's speaking about someone who sounds very much like Joseph Smith. Is this also applying to Joseph Smith, or is it speaking now of someone else? I think that's something to consider. But as we go on with Isaiah 9, verse 4, it says, for you have smashed the yoke that burdened them, the staff of submission, the rod of those who subjected them. All of these words are those key code words for this end time Assyrian. It says, as in the days of Midian's defeat. That's a really specific prophecy that he's referring to, and he's going to refer to it again later. So we should pay attention, and we will. We'll go into this at the second time that it's mentioned. But going on, it says, and all boots used in battle and tunics rolled in blood have become fuel for bonfires. So again, this reversal of circumstances, a servant who comes in to help free God's people and perform many wondrous and marvelous works. And there are several things that are going to be restored during this time. And one of those will be that restoration at the beginning of the millennium that really, in many ways, has already begun, which is the resurrection. So, a restoration with our loved ones on the other side of the veil. A lot of that's happening already through temple work, but we will have certain priesthood that is restored to us, including this gift of resurrection. So in Doctrine and Covenants 45:45, it says, before the arm of the Lord shall fall, and all these calamities really take place, an angel shall sound his trump, and the saints that have slept shall come forth to meet me in the cloud. Then I have here from Exodus 8, verses 16 and 18, Aaron is told to raise his staff and strike the ground. This has to do with the third plague of Egypt. I've mentioned this before, that of the 10 plagues of Egypt, the first 3 were the ones that Israel was subjected to. And then after that, there was a separation. And the third plague is also really interesting in that it says the dust will turn into swarms of gnats throughout the land of Egypt. All the dust in the land of Egypt turned into gnats, and Pharaoh's magicians tried to do the same thing with their secret arts. But this time they failed. What do we know about the coming day? We know that there are going to be like these miraculous signs and wonders performed by this Antichrist figure. And it says that if it were possible, even the very elect might be deceived. But what is the one thing that God can do that Satan cannot? He cannot resurrect glorified celestial beings. Verse 6, for unto us a child is born, a son appointed. Now that word son should start making your ears to perk up at this point. We know that that's a covenant term that has to do with these servants who covenant with Jehovah and then have an everlasting and unconditional covenant. And it says, who will shoulder the burden of government. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, One Mighty in Valor, a Father forever, a Prince of Peace, just like what Abraham was seeking for and what Melchizedek was, right? Another way of saying One Mighty Valor could be a divine warrior. So what is this talking about? Because we know that this is referenced in Handel's Messiah, in reference to Jesus Christ. But actually, this is hearkening back to that prophecy earlier about Emmanuel, God is with us, a virgin shall conceive. And in Isaiah's time, that was referencing Hezekiah. And for our time, this is referencing this son who is birthed. Like we mentioned in our last lesson, there's a rebirth, someone who's appointed and rises up as part of this rebirth into a higher state where he's empowered to do these kinds of things. And if you go to Doctrine and Covenants 85, starting with verse 7, it says, and it shall come to pass that I, the Lord God, will send one mighty, like mighty in valor, and strong, holding the scepter of power in his hand, clothed with light, that light that will break, right, that people will see, for a covering, whose mouth shall utter words, eternal words, while his bowels shall be a fountain of truth, to set in order the house of God, and to arrange by lot the inheritances of the saints whose names are found, and the names of their fathers and of their children enrolled in the book of the law of God. And while that man who was called of God and appointed, that putteth forth his hand to steady the ark of God, shall fall by the shaft of death, like as a tree that is smitten by the vivid shaft of lightning, and all they who are not found written in the book of remembrance shall find none inheritance in that day. So I believe this is also referring to that day, this time where someone is appointed. This seems to also harken back to a previous prophecy that we read in Isaiah, where I referenced there was Eliakim, who there was a nail in a sure place, and then that nail was removed, and a new nail in a sure place was put in. There's something along these lines as we go on with this prophecy that you'll see where leaders are removed, just like Nephi, who took off Laban's head. They're cut off, and then they're replaced with more faithful servants. Okay, going on with this prophecy, verse 7 of Isaiah 9, that sovereignty may be extended and peace have no end. The millennial era is ushered in, right? That on the throne of David and over his kingdom, his rule may be established and upheld by justice and righteousness from this time forth and forever. The zeal, Jehovah of hosts, will accomplish it. Now, remember that Jehovah, or Jesus, is the King of kings. And there will be kings and queens of the Gentiles. And their leader will be the one alongside them, these workers in the vineyard, so to speak, to establish this kingdom. When Jesus came initially, the reason why the Jews rejected him is because they were looking for these prophecies to be fulfilled. And they didn't understand that Jesus came to establish the spiritual kingdom of God first, that you have to establish that first before you can have the physical or political kingdom of God established. And that's because you need a people who are Christ-like enough to bring about that kind of fulfillment. And of course, there were other prophecies that needed to be fulfilled. There were other Zion, I would say, communities that had been established, but a lot of other things needed to take place before that could happen. But we are living in a time now where in order to establish a political kingdom of God, you could say, a nation, you need a nation of kings and queens like this and like this servant. Now, this presentation is entitled a restoration. There's also going to be a restoration of land. It says in 2 Nephi 1, verse 7, wherefore this land is consecrated unto him, whom he shall bring. And if it so be that they shall serve him according to the commandments which he hath given, it shall be a land of liberty unto them. Wherefore they shall never be brought down into captivity. If so, it shall be because of iniquity. For if iniquity shall abound, cursed shall be the land for their sakes, but unto the righteous it shall be blessed forever. So there's a covenant curse and a covenant blessing in relation to these covenants that were made to Lehi and others. Okay, so now let's go back to the prophecy in Isaiah, starting at verse 8 of chapter 9. This message my Lord sent to Jacob, and it shall befall Israel, and the entire people, Ephraim and those who dwell in Samaria, so these northern lost tribes or Ephraimite tribes, right, shall know of it, who say in pride and arrogance of heart, the bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with hewn stone. The sycamores have been felled, but we will replace them with cedars. But Jehovah will strengthen Rezin's army against them when he stirs up their adversaries. Arameans from the east and Philistines from the west will devour with open mouth. Something that I find really interesting here is, if you're not aware of this, after 9/11, this very verse in Isaiah 9, verse 10, was quoted twice. And it's interesting how this happened, because they seem to misinterpret what this prophecy was saying. So let's go there now.
Nothing can replace the losses of those that have suffered. I know that there is only the smallest measure of inspiration that can be taken from this devastation. But there is a passage in the Bible from Isaiah that I think speaks to all of us at times like this. The bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with dressed stone. The fig trees have been felled, but we will replace them with cedars.
Okay, and then we're going to move on to this next one. At this meeting, lots of dramatic music, of course, in this version that I found online.
Thank you. Today, on this day of remembrance and mourning, we have the Lord's word to get us through. The bricks have fallen, but we will build with dressed stones. The sycamores have been cut down, but we will put cedars in their place. This is taken from Isaiah, the 9th chapter, the 10th verse.
So how terribly ironic. First of all, that what do you have that was destroyed in 9/11? You have towers. And what's been a theme really since the beginning of our study of the Book of Mormon and Isaiah? Towers. What are towers built for? Well, they're either built to get to God or get to some other God according to man's way, according to the arm of flesh and their strength, rather than relying on the strength and grace of God. And isn't it ironic, again, that they didn't read the verses right before and after? That the people who are saying this very quote are saying it in the pride and arrogance of their hearts. And that Jehovah is going to strengthen this countries, these people, this nation's enemies against them. And it says both from the east and the west, meaning essentially, if you remember that map I showed earlier, invaders on both the west coast and the east coast is one way that you could say it. It also reminds me of Isaiah 29, where he says, these people, they draw near unto me with their mouths, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And I think this is probably a perfect example of that. And it goes on to say that, yet for all this, his anger is not abated. His hand is raised up still. Again, Isaiah is constantly drawing in these old archetypes of Moses and the children of Israel in the wilderness, just like Nephi does. So he's referencing that time where they're fighting against their armies, and Moses is raising his staff. And he says that as long as this staff is raised up, Israel will prevail. But when it lowers, they would start to lose the battle. So he has two people on either side of him who help him. They sit him on a stone, and Israel prevails. Going on to verse 13, but the people do not turn back to him who smites them, nor will they inquire of Jehovah of hosts. Therefore, Jehovah will cut off from Israel head and tail, palm top and reed in a single day. Now, that day being the day of Jehovah. And then Isaiah goes on to interpret his own prophecy. The elders or the notables are the head, the prophets who teach falsehoods, the tail. The leaders of these people have misled them, and those who are led are confused. My Lord is not pleased with their young men, nor does he pity their fatherless and widows, because all are alike, godless malefactors. Every mouth utters profanities. Yet for all this, his anger is not abated. His hand is upraised still. Okay, what's this saying? Does God have no compassion for widows and the fatherless? No, I don't think so. In fact, let's go to D&C 38. And in this section, the Lord gives us a parable. It is, and by Lord, I mean Jesus Christ. Like we're told at the beginning of Doctrine and Covenants, it's very much like the book of Isaiah in that it's Jehovah or Jesus who is doing all the talking here in these prophecies. And he starts talking about Zion and Enoch, that city that was taken up. And that a day is going to come that is soon, and the person who is not purified will not abide the day. For all flesh is corrupt, right? And now he's going to talk about this time. And he says that for our salvation, I give unto you a commandment, right? That I have heard your prayers. The poor have complained before me. The rich have I made, and all flesh is mine. I am no respecter of persons. I've made the earth rich. And he says, I want to give you greater riches, even a land of promise that's flowing with milk and honey, upon which there shall be no curse when the Lord cometh. There is a curse, actually, a covenant curse that's going to be taking place because of the wickedness. But he says, this will be the land of your inheritance. If you seek it with all your hearts, there will be no king, no ruler, eventually, because people will hear my voice. They're going to follow me. You'll be a free people. You'll have no laws but my laws, because the ultimate freedom really comes in obeying the laws of God. And then he goes on to talk about every man should esteem his brother as himself. And again, I say unto you, let every man esteem his brother as himself. And then he gives us this parable in verse 26. For what man among you, having 12 sons, and is no respecter of them, and they serve him obediently, and he saith unto the one, be thou clothed in robes, and sit here. And to the other, be thou clothed in rags, and sit thou there. And looketh upon his sons, and saith, I am just. Behold, this I have given unto you as a parable, and it is even as I am. I say unto you, be one, and if ye are not one, ye are not mine. What's God saying? Now, what's Jesus saying here? Is he saying that, well, yeah, this is me. I'm giving some people riches and I'm choosing to have other people clothed in rags and sitting in poverty. That's who I am. No. What he's saying here is that because we are not living up to the laws of consecration and the things that we covenant to do in the temple that we should understand and be doing, because we are his hands, because we are his mouth and his arms, and acting as his representatives here, this is how we are making God out to be. This is the God that we are perpetuating upon our fellow men, our brothers and sisters. There is no equality. And therefore, because of that, there can be no Zion. And the land is cursed until we can truly see other people as ourselves, to, like you said, to esteem them as ourselves, to not see them as separate or other, or as our enemy or less deserving or whatever it is, that we need to learn how to live up to this law. Otherwise, the curses that are spoken of in the scriptures and things will come upon us because we're not living up to our covenants. And as we go on, we're going to hear in Isaiah 10 this Antichrist talk about how all his commanders are king. Are not all my commanders kings, one and all? And I would say that you could have Jehovah say the same thing about us, those who bear the responsibility of the covenant and the priesthood in this day and age. Are we not all kings, one and all? Like Lehi said to his posterity, this land is established as a land of liberty. Why? Because you need a place where people can experiment with freedom and ruling and reigning over their own household, over their own lives, over their own property and businesses. This is a place and a time where we have been given the opportunity to exercise that freedom according to the freedom of God and equality or unto captivity. And so what I would ask you is, what kind of king are you? Are you the kind of king who's like King Benjamin that I have shown here, who led by example in helping people, in serving his people, in teaching them to treat one another the way that God would have them treat each other? Or are you the kind of king who, well, church is church and business is business, and they're separate things, and sometimes, you know, you just have to do things the way of the world, and are workers seen as your equals, or are they people to be used and stepped on? Do you see what I'm getting at here? There's a reason why we're called kings and queens of the Gentiles, and we've had a time to be prepared to exercise righteous or unrighteous dominion. And according to how we have exercised that, that is how we will ultimately be judged. And if you have any question as to where we are along this path of judgment, well, look at our leaders. I mean, like we just read, the notables and the pastors or the religious leaders, they're going to be cut off. Well, our leaders are merely a reflection of us. I I know a lot of people are caught up in the election and this and that and who's it? Oh, I hate this person. Oh, I love this person. Oh, we need this person. And I just think, well, if you, first of all, really don't like the options that are being presented to you, just understand that that's a mirror that's being held up to our society. And the very things that are prophesied to happen to these heads and tails are the same things that will happen to the people who have not prepared spiritually. All right, so going on now to verse 18 of chapter 9. Wickedness shall be set ablaze like a fire, and briars and thorns shall it consume. It shall ignite the jungle forests, and they shall billow upwards in mushrooming clouds of smoke at the wrath of Jehovah of hosts. The earth is scorched, and people are but fuel for the fire. Men will have no compassion for one another. Now, this harkens back, I believe, to Judges 9. There's a situation where after Gideon, who he's going to mention later in this battle with the Midianites that we already mentioned earlier, after Gideon is gone, he has something like, I believe it's 77 sons, but then he has this one son that's kind of illegitimate in a way. I mean, not as legitimate as the other ones. And he seeks to rule the people, even though his claim really isn't legitimate. He claims it through his mother, which is interesting to consider in other ways. I won't go into that, but he claims the throne, and the people accept him. And he has this, I believe, one brother who's named Jotham. He kills all his brothers, and he's the last one that's left. And he gives the people a parable, and he says that the people went to all these beautiful trees, like an olive tree and a fig tree, and said, hey, rule over us. But these trees said, no, like I'm doing my job, providing fruit, providing oil. Why would I step down from something, a grander thing, to just do that position of rulership? And it says, so finally he goes to a thorn bush, or they go to a thorn bush, and they ask him to rule them. And he says, yes, but if you don't follow me, I'm going to set you all on fire, something to that effect. So then what happens? Well, there's, I would say, civil unrest after Jotham takes over. And so he goes and just starts scouring the land, burning, literally gathering people up, like it says in this prophecy, burning them, those who oppose him. But what happens at the end of this prophecy is what I find so interesting. So in Judges 9, it says that Abimelech, the one who went through and was attacking and doing all of these things, attacked the town of Thebes and captured it. But there was a strong tower inside the town. Now, other people had gathered to the temple, interestingly enough, these temples that they had, and they were burned. But these people were in a tower. And all the men and women, the entire population, fled to it. They barricaded themselves in and climbed up to the roof of the tower. Abimelech followed them to attack the tower. As he prepared to set fire to the entrance, a woman on the roof dropped a millstone that landed on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. And interestingly enough, he tells his servant, I'm going to die. Just take out your sword and slay me so it won't be said that Abimelech was killed by a woman. He's very much an antichrist figure. And I can tell you from experience, if you just look at world history, nobody is more misogynistic or hates women more than Satan. I mean, just think about it. He has gone after women so much throughout history and hates them. And yet, in this story, it was a woman who crushed his skull. Does that ring any bells for you? In the Garden of Eden, Adam was taken into Eden in the biblical account. So Eden is up higher, and in this higher place is where Eve is revealed to him. And it is her seed. I mean, Eve was called woman initially, but then she's given this new name of Eve or Hava. And that Ha in her name. It's very significant. It's really close to the Savior and all of that. So it says that her seed will have the power to crush Satan's head. A lot of people interpret that as, well, that's Christ. And sure, yes, that's true too. But in a millennial context, who's going to crush his head? It will be the seed of Eve. It will be these people who, in the millennial time, as it says, Satan will have no power over the hearts of men because they will choose righteousness. It will be those people who are reborn and, I would say, retransfigured into this terrestrial and celestial millennial state. And of course, jungle forests, trees in this parable of Jotham in the scriptures refer to people. So what could jungle forest mean? It could be literal, but it could also mean entire nations or cities of people who are not covenant people. I mean, what are in jungles? A lot of unkosher animals. And this mushrooming clouds of smoke, it's basically the interpretation is columns of smoke that billow. So interpret that how you will. And going on with this idea of the earth being scorched, like in Judges 9, verse 20 of Isaiah 9 says, they will snatch on the right, yet remain hungry. They will devour on the left, but not be satisfied. Men will eat the flesh of their own offspring. Manasseh will turn against Ephraim and Ephraim against Manasseh, and both will combine against Judah. Yet for all this, his anger is not abated. His hand is upraised still. Manasseh and Ephraim, we've discussed earlier how both came to this promised land, both in the time of Lehi as well as in modern times. So could this be a reference to some kind of civil unrest, civil war, just like in that parable in Judges 9 or in Judges? There could be a lot of ways of interpreting that, but one interesting thing about God's hand being upraised in that story of Moses that I failed to mention earlier is that same rod that he's holding up that helps Israel to succeed against the Amalekites is also the same rod that just a couple verses before Moses was told to use to strike the rock and water gushed forth. So those living waters, the people were fed by those living waters, I would say, before they then had to face the enemy with God's servant leading them and had that success. This is going to relate later on to that story of Gideon and the Midianites. But in the meantime, what we're seeing is all the judgment upon the wicked coming to pass. And as we continue on with chapter 10, it says, woe to those who enact unjust laws, who draft oppressive legislation, denying justice to the needy. So this idea of the poor again, depriving the poor of my people of their right. Now, my people, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but in Isaiah, there's a distinction between my people and the people or these people. And if God says my people, he's speaking about those that he considers to be part of his fold, his sheep. So those people are being deprived of their civil rights. And then it says that those who are doing this are making plunder of widows, mere spoil of the fatherless. So let's go into this a little bit, because I believe that this applies to right now as well as in the future. But let's just look at the types and shadows of our time, shall we? Now, there's a lot of unrest going on right now. You could say that we have a flood coming in along our borders, and it's got a lot of people really upset. A lot of people are scared. On the other side, obviously there is a need for some compassion, because the main reason why so many people are fleeing to our borders is because of all of this unrest that's going on worldwide. And of course, that's not to say that there aren't conspiratorial things going on that are making this happen. In fact, that's my point here with this next slide, which says, remember who the real enemy is. Now, a lot of the claims that are being made of we got to keep these people away is because, they're bringing in all this fentanyl and all these people are dying. Well, if you look at the numbers, just all drugs, not even just fentanyl, all drug overdoses for the year 2021 were at around 107,622. People who died from cancer, and these statistics are a little older. I believe these are going to be radically different, but cancer is around 553,000. Number two death is in the US is 699,000. That's cardiovascular disease. The number one cause of death in the United States at a whopping 783,936 is iatrogenic illness. What does that mean? That is illness that is caused by our very own medical system, specifically the pharmaceutical industry, the drug companies. So if we're worried about drug dealers harming people in our nation, just keep in mind that you have legal drug cartels that wield incredible power and authority within our government. They're literally the most powerful lobbyists in our government. And that's not taking into account other incredibly powerful lobbyists like the arms dealers who profit off of civil unrest in other countries, war with other countries. It is big bucks. Let's discuss how about the food industry that makes it so that poor people in this country are actually obese. Why? Because unhealthy foods are cheaper and easier to access than healthy food. They make money off of selling us their foods that do not have our best interest at heart, a lot of which contain carcinogenic ingredients in them that aren't even allowed in other countries, that cause cardiovascular, that make us sick. Then we go in, then we get on these pharmaceuticals. And then we have politicians, even in my own state. I have written to politicians who were very popular at the time, very well loved, very much in the media, who were signing on to legislation that protected these industries, that prevented people who were injured by the pharmaceutical industry, by the medical industry, made it more difficult for them to receive any sort of financial restitution or recompense for the injuries they received. And I just called them out and said, how is this helping your constituents, protecting these major monoliths of power? And I would say that's even on a smaller level. On a much more macro level, then of course you have even more going on behind the scenes that is creating all of this unrest and contention and all of these things and trying to get us to fight with each other, to get us into a state where we are confused, where we are distracted, where we are enraged, so that we are actually more compliant and more easily manipulated. And of course, that's not even to mention that the United States is the #1 producer and consumer of child abuse content. We're in the top 3 nations of the origin for victims of human trafficking, which were the US, Mexico, and the Philippines were the top 3. That the largest number of people trafficked into the United States come from East Asia and the Pacific. So we're talking about literal enslavement here, not just sex trafficking, but slavery in other ways. And that the next highest number of slaves who are brought in here are from Latin America and then Europe and Eurasia. Are these people part of the lost tribes? I think so. And I also think that this relates to this prophecy in Isaiah, at the very least, a foreshadowing, because it says that of the 600,000 to 800,000 people, and these numbers are just, it's really hard to even get real numbers or good numbers with these because we just don't know, it's so hidden. But of those 600 to 800,000 people who are trafficked across international borders each year, 70% are women and 50% are children. And what were we just told? We have people enacting unjust laws who have no compassion on women and children. And by the way, the majority of those victims are forced into the sex trade. And then just to finish up this summary of these statistics, each year an estimated 14,500 to 17,500 foreign nationals are trafficked into the United States. The number of US citizens trafficked within the country each year is even higher, with an estimated 200,000 American children, just children alone, at risk for trafficking into the sex industry. So our leaders, the palm tops, right? And then the tails who are supposedly leading us spiritually in some way are the ones enacting these unjust laws. And I know because I've actually worked or housed or adopted people from other countries who come here who are refugees or are coming here on maybe student visa trying to get a better life, and our laws are structured in such a way that they can't even earn a living legally. They are actually forced to work illegally, so that essentially our laws are structured so that we have a slave class within the United States. And then these people, even though they're working illegally, the people who are employing them pay taxes. So there's money taken out of their checks that go to taxes for which actually they can't. I know there's a lot of debate over this right now. And again, I'm not trying to get political, but I know from firsthand experience, these people cannot apply for certain government programs and things like that, either if they're here on refugee status or on student visa status, but are working illegally. They actually can't get certain things because of that. And yet they're paying taxes to this government, which is essentially enslaving them or keeping them in poverty. I have been in a situation where I needed to go on government assistance. We needed the healthcare, we needed food stamps, and we couldn't actually get them because of a technicality. We were poorer than the people around us who were on food stamps, ironically. And yet we were doing our best to overcome that poverty. And that was really the first time where I realized how our laws are established to keep people in poverty. If you try to work your way out of that poverty, you're penalized. And so either you stay dependent on the government or you risk everything and get off. And I believe that's the scenario that we have here that is going to lead to the destruction of these wicked leaders and of such a wicked nation. And of course, spoil of the fatherless could literally mean to catch them like prey and take them away, like it talks about in Isaiah. So then I would say that also goes on to another prophecy and a fulfillment of this in another way. Okay, so I had this document, but I didn't have it here on my computer. So I'm going to be reading this off of a Twitter post here, which is fortuitous. So in May of 1868, you have Heber C. Kimball. And this is actually a couple prophecies that are pieced together, not just the 1868 one, but the bulk of it is from that. And it says, after a while, the Gentiles will gather in Salt Lake City by the thousands, and this will be among the wicked cities of the world. A spirit of speculation and extravagance will take possession of the saints, and the result will be financial bondage. An army of elders will be sent to the four quarters of the earth to search out the righteous and warn the wicked of coming events. All kinds of religions will be started and miracles performed that will deceive the very elect if such a thing were possible. Persecution comes next, and all Latter-day Saints will be tested to the limit. Many will apostatize, and others will stand still, not knowing what to do. Before the temple reaches the square, and I believe this is speaking of the temple that is supposed to be in Jackson County, before that temple reaches the square, our brethren will be imprisoned until the penitentiary shall be full, and some of them will be removed to other penitentiaries. So even a type of enslavement, you can say, but through the jails or the legal system. Mothers would weep for their husbands, and children would cry for their fathers. Some would die, and sorrow would fill the hearts of the Latter-day Saints. When the temple roof is on, the persecution will lessen. But when the temple is completed, the power of the evil one will be shut out. The prayers of the saints will then be heard. The sick will be taken there and healed. The Spirit of God will rest upon the people, and work for the dead will be continued night and day. The judgments of God will be poured out upon the wicked to the extent that our elders from far and near will be called home, or in other words, the gospel will be taken from the Gentiles and later on will be carried to the Jews. The western boundaries of the state of Missouri will be swept so clean of its inhabitants that, as President Young tells us, when we return to that place, there will not be so much as a yellow dog to wag his tail. Before that day comes, however, saints will be put to the test that will try the very best of them. The pressure will become so great that the righteous among us will cry unto the Lord day and night until deliverance comes. And then it speaks of how in 1856 there was some saints that were in what he called the endowment house, and there was a conversation, and he said, "Yes," said Brother Heber, "we think we are secure here in the chambers of these everlasting hills, where we can close the doors of the canyons against mobs and persecutors, the wicked and the vile, who have always beset us with violence and robbery. But I want to say to you, my brethren, the time is coming when we will be mixed up in these now peaceful valleys to the extent that it will be difficult to tell the face of a saint from the face of an enemy against the people of God. Then is the time to look out for the great sieve, for there will be a great sifting time, and many will fall. For I say unto you that there is a test, a test, a test coming." He further said, "This church has before it many close places through which it will have to pass before the work of God is crowned with glory. The difficulties will be of such a character that the man or woman who does not possess personal knowledge or witness will fall. If you have not got this testimony, you must live right and call upon the Lord and cease not until you obtain it. Remember these sayings. The time will come when no man or woman will be able to endure on borrowed light. Each will have to be guided by the light within themselves. If you do not have the knowledge of that Jesus is the Christ, how can you stand?" And of course, Heber C. Kimball was referred to by Brigham Young as his prophet, Brigham Young's prophet. So that would make Heber C. Kimball a prophet's prophet. And interestingly enough, Isaiah is referred to as a prophet's prophet. So going back to Isaiah 10, now we're on verse 3. What will you do in the day of reckoning? When the Holocaust overtakes you from afar, to whom will you flee for help? Where will you leave your wealth? There shall nothing remain but to kneel among the captives or fall among the slain. Yet for all this, his anger is not abated. His hand is raised up still. Of course, this is the antithesis to that Moses figure, because this is the Antichrist, who is this hand that's upraised. Hail the Assyrian, the rod of my anger. He is a staff, my wrath in their hand. Interestingly, I will commission him against a godless nation, appoint him over the people deserving of my vengeance, to pillage for plunder, to spoliate for spoil, to tread underfoot like mud in the streets. Nevertheless, it shall not seem so to him. This shall not be what he has in mind. His purpose shall be to annihilate and to exterminate nations, not a few. So this is again this idea of him taking over nations, depopulating the earth, speaking of food and corrupted and conspiring leaders. I think about what's going on with our food right now with this World Economic Forum and these meetings that they have, where the plan is to force farmers, right? They're picking literally on I would say not the poor, but in some areas it is, like in India, the poor or the people who are producing our food, and they're trying to force them to do things a certain way that is not natural, or they buy them out so that they can't produce certain things. And there have been so many uprisings among farmers throughout the world. And interestingly enough, of course, we're told that they're doing this for the good of humanity, right? Because this is going to help save the planet, save the earth from humanity. And yet you have people like Vandana Shiva, brilliant, brilliant activist, who has a plan that could reduce carbon emissions way faster than any of the goals that these economic forum places have set up, would be way more efficient at it. And all it would require really is letting our farming practices and the people who want to farm naturally go back to traditional natural ways of farming. But that's not the goal of these people who say that they're trying to help humanity, is it? Very much the opposite. How much are they trying to remove us from the land? How much have we had food be manipulated or be destroyed in various ways. I would say during the pandemics, just so much going on to get between us and food and this earth, who is going through a transformation, no doubt. There are changes taking place. Some of it is because of the wickedness of mankind, certainly. Um, the earth can only take so much as a righteous presence in and of herself. But some of this is simply the path of descent that is required before the ascent into a higher terrestrial sphere. And I can tell you that no plans created by people whose only goal really is more power and more wealth and more control over humanity, they are not going to be the ones to present the solutions or going to change God's plans ultimately, although they will try. Verse 8, he will say, are not my commanders kings, one and all? Has not Calno fared like Carchemish? Is not Hamath as Arpad? Samaria no better than Damascus? As I could do to the pagan states, whose statutes exceeded those of Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not do to Jerusalem and its images, even as I did to Samaria and its idols? So it's saying he went to other places in the world. This has already taken place in those nations, and now maybe going to Christian nations. Can't I just do the same thing? And its idols, well, who's toppled in these nations? Probably their leaders, as along with their idols of economics, fortune, just anything that we have set up. But I would say a lot of people idolize their leaders, certain leaders or voices that they follow, either political or whatever, and those are what will be ultimately toppled. So don't place your trust in the arm of flesh. But when my Lord has fully accomplished his work on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, so two places of Zion really, he will punish the king of Syria for his notorious boasting and infamous conceit, because he said, I have done it by my own ability and shrewdness, for I am ingenious. I have done away with the borders of nations. I have ravaged their reserves. I have vastly reduced the inhabitants. I have impounded the wealth of peoples like a nest, and I have gathered up the whole world as one gathers abandoned eggs. Not one flapped its wings, nor opened its mouth to utter a peep. Think about that. Eggs. Abandoned eggs that have not been birthed yet. He gathers them up. Well, who's supposed to keep watch over them, or who should they have been with? Their mother hen? And Jehovah goes on to say, shall an axe exalt itself above the one who hews with it, or a saw vaunt itself over him who handles it, as though the rod wielded him who lifts it up, as though the staff held up the one who is not made of wood. So he's saying here, look, this is all part of the plan. Nothing's gone wrong here. And this person who thinks that this is his plan or thinks he's in control and is doing all this doesn't realize he's really just fulfilling the Lord's purposes, who also wants to break down the barriers of nations and bring us all together as one, and who is allowing him to do this so that the wicked will be removed from the face of the earth, so that the righteous can inherit it. Therefore, will the Lord Jehovah of hosts send a consumption into his fertile lands. His fertile lands, I'm assuming that means this tyrant, and cause a fire to flare up like a burning hearth to undermine his glory. The light of Israel will be the fire, and their Holy One, the flame. So there's two kinds of fire here, like I've mentioned this before. There's the destruction and the fires of war and things like that, and then there's the actual light of God. And it says that it shall burn up and devour his briars and thorns in a single day. Now, again, this can be the day of Jehovah, but there's also prophecies that are similar that happen like in the time of Hezekiah, in the book of Revelation, where there is some miraculous divine intervention that happens like immediately. And it says that his choice forests and productive fields, again, forests have lots of trees, those could be nations, things like that, It will consume both life and substance, turning them into a rotting morass. And the trees left of his forest shall be so few that a child could record them. Well, remember, we were talking about a child is born, a son that's conceived. So is this relating to that servant figure who is recording him in that book that was discussed, the book of the law of God and Doctrine and Covenants, or the book of life, as it mentions in Isaiah, those names that will be recorded? And of the trees that are left, we spoke about this earlier. It speaks of how a terebinth and an oak will be cut down, but that there's this stump that remains. And interestingly enough, you could make the case that the terebinth is a female word for God, and the oak would be the masculine version of that. So 2 trees, like in the Garden of Eden, 1 male and 1 female, like Adam and Eve. Verse 20, in that day, those who survive, so in that day, right? Those who survive of Israel and who escape of the house of Jacob will no longer rely on him who struck them, but will truly rely on Jehovah, the Holy One of Israel. Of Jacob, a remnant will return to the one mighty in valor. And I would say this is a point at which certain lost tribes, or those who are now ready to truly humble themselves and turn to Jehovah, this is when they actually let go of all the things, like we discussed in our last lesson, let go of all the things that they thought they needed that would bring them safety. It sounds like, yes, they do turn to this Assyrian character for safety or some sort of security. And then they realize that they made the wrong choice. And this is when they let go of Babylon and get themselves out, spiritually speaking, and then can be gathered into Zion. For though your people, O Israel, be as the sands of the sea, only a remnant will return. Remember that tithe of a tithe that were related to that terebinth and the oak being cut down, the most holy offering. Although annihilation is decreed, it shall overflow with righteousness. For the Lord Jehovah of hosts will carry out the utter destruction decreed upon the whole earth. Through this person, though. Therefore, thus says my Lord Jehovah of hosts, O my people who inhabit Zion, be not afraid of the Assyrians, though they strike you with the rod, or raise their staff over you as did the Egyptians. My anger will very soon come to an end. My wrath will become their undoing. So the wicked being killed by the wicked. Jehovah of hosts will raise the whip against them as when he struck the Midianites at the rock of Oreb. So what's he talking about here? Let's get into the story now of Gideon. In the book of Judges, in Gideon's day, it says that the people were handed over by the Lord to the Midianites because of their wickedness for a period of 7 years, interestingly enough, right? That period of 3.5 and 3.5, like we've mentioned before. And that these Midianites were so cruel that people actually went into hiding. And the Midianites would go in and they would destroy their food supplies, interestingly enough, leaving them nothing to eat. So when we come upon Gideon, he's actually secretly gathering in the wheat. That seems like a metaphor to me. Gideon also is from the tribe of Manasseh. So, and at this time now, there's an alliance that forms against Israel. And so God calls Gideon to face off against these Midianites. But he says there's too many. There are some 32,000, I believe, of these tribes that he gathers together, or people from his tribe. And so he has them cut their numbers and then cuts them again till basically what you have left is about 300, or a tithe of a tithe. And so then he gives them torches in these clay jars. They all have horns that they blow, much like these angels that blow their horns in the last days. And they break these clay jars And these clay pots were covering the light of the torches. So when they broke them, it was like this great light that all of a sudden broke forth or was seen among the people. And what happens is that the wicked, some of them kind of already know that God is with these people and that they're doomed to fail. But because of the noise and the light and whatever, these people are in a state of chaos and they actually start killing each other. So here you have a story where the wicked are taking out the wicked, and then Ephraim joins now with Manasseh, and so thus the people of God are spared. And going on now with verse 26 of chapter 10, it says that his staff, Jehovah's staff, is over the sea, and he will lift it over them, as he did to the Egyptians. In that day, their burdens shall be lifted from your shoulders, their yoke removed from your neck. The yoke that wore away your fatness shall by fatness wear away. Meaning that the scent that you went through and the people who put you through that actually humbled you so that your heart wasn't fat. Remember, we talked about why that was a problem? That those now with the fat hearts are the ones who are going to destroy themselves. Like, basically, I mean, it's the same theme over and over again. He advances on Ayath, passes through Migron. At Michmash, he marshals his weaponry. They cross over the pass, stopping over at Geba. Ramah is in a state of alarm. So, according to Abraham, there's a lot of like wordplay or puns that is going on here. So, this now actually is talking about an invasion, and that specifically they're going to go up against Zion. And it says that then will my Lord Jehovah of hosts shatter the towering trees with terrifying power. The high in stature shall be hewn down, the lofty ones leveled. The dense forest shall be battered down with the forces of iron. And Lebanon falls spectacularly. Lebanon, the trees of Lebanon are a big thing in these. So this is a scenario much like, as we'll read about later on with Hezekiah, where the Assyrians are right up to their neck, right up to their neck. They're going to breach the walls of Jerusalem. They're going to get into the city, the holy city, the Zion city. But because of divine intervention, they're just, yeah, they don't even have to like fight them in that scenario. So again, this goes back to the idea that those who become the light, like the servant who is that light that the people see, which is really a reflection of the light of Jehovah, that it is that righteousness that protects people and the covenants and the truth that comes forth that is not rejected, that will help those people. Now, that's not to say that some righteous people won't get caught up in this, but what I would say from this is to remember what destroyed the Midianites, and it was actually their own fear. That I believe this is a theme over and over again, that what we focus on or the seeds that we plant is what will grow. And I believe this is also why President Nelson keeps telling us to think celestial. You know, are there things going on at the border? Are there things going on with politics? Yes. And you're welcome to have a political opinion either way of how to go about handling this at this time. But the caution is to not get caught up in the drama. If you are coming from a place of fear, of anger, of rage, of righteous indignation, even I would say, which is more like self-righteous indignation, if that's where you're coming from, then by wickedness will the wicked be devoured. If you can take a step back and look at this from a celestial perspective of, look, these are just the signs of the times. We knew this was coming. This should not be a surprise to anyone. And also, it's always the poor. It's always the minorities. It's always the people who are weak in society that are used by those in power whose whose problems are manipulated by people who are just out to get something for themselves. And so to be very careful too of not blaming the people who are caught up, who are the poor, who are the downtrodden, who really, really do need help, but aren't being helped by the policies and the things that wicked and unrighteous governments are enacting. But to have compassion in your hearts, to still be able to approach these things with love and understanding that everyone is your brother and sister, whatever side of the political aisle they are on, they are not your enemy. Remember who the real enemy is. For we are not fighting against flesh and blood, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places, like it says in Ephesians 6. And like it says in Alma 41. In speaking of this idea of restoration, and I'm applying this to the end times, to the millennial day. And if their works are evil, they shall be restored unto them evil for evil. Therefore, all things shall be restored to their proper order, everything to its natural frame. The one raised to happiness according to his desires of happiness, or good according to his desires of good, and the other to evil according to his desires of evil. For as he has desired to do evil all the day long, even so shall he have his reward of evil when the night cometh. And so it is on the other hand, if he hath repented of his sins and desired righteousness until the end of his days, even so he shall be rewarded unto righteousness. These are they that are redeemed of the Lord. A restoration via redemption by not just resurrection, like I mentioned earlier, but redemption into the presence of Christ and thus our heavenly parents themselves. That is the ultimate redemption and promise of the millennial age, really. So these are they that are redeemed of the Lord, yea, these are they that are taken out. There's the translation, or our Christian brothers and sisters call it a rapture. But these are they that are taken out, that are delivered from that endless night of darkness. And thus they stand or fall. For behold, they are their own judges, whether to do good or do evil. So as the world continues to go through this transition into this dark night of descent, at its darkest point in history before that ascent to the light, just know that nothing has gone wrong. Everything really is as it should be and will be ultimately for the benefit of those who trust in Jesus Christ. And we're going to see some beautiful examples of this in the Book of Mormon, where, you know, if things are happening and you need to stand up for what's right, maybe you will need to. Who's to say if an invader comes to your home, you might not need to defend your family, but remember that the people who had the greatest protection, who ultimately overcame their enemies, were the ones who were willing to lay down their lives, who are willing to sacrifice for the next generation or for others so that they could be brought unto Christ. And so I would just echo the words of President Nelson, which is, whatever situation you encounter in the coming days, think celestial. And I will share this with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.